Hello. Today I want to talk about word counts while querying. I'm in a lot of querying communities, and this is a discussion that keeps coming up over and over again. How important is it to stick to conventionally recommended word counts when querying, and how bad is it to go over the suggested word counts? At what point are agents just going to start auto-rejecting your material? So I'm going to cover three topics. The first topic is going to be my journey with word count, because I did query with what is considered quite a high word count for my genre, and I did get an agent, and my agent submitted to editors at a much higher word count than is generally recommended to submit to editors in our genre. And my debut, which is coming out next year, is going to be on the long end for what is the conventional wisdom for a debut in my genre. So I'm gonna share that story, but then part two is going to be why I highly recommend that even though it worked for me, you don't do what I did, and all the reasons that I think it is so important to stick to recommended word counts, and what might happen if you go over, and what you'll be working against if you go over by too much. And then the third topic I'll cover is why it matters, right? This seems unfair. Why can established authors write a longer book? It seems like the market wants longer books. So why is this happening? Why are debuts being held to this standard? So those are going to be the three topics. And I am going to be using, for pretty much all of the examples, YA fantasy, because that is the genre I write in. It's the genre I know best. But I do think that all of these things apply to other genres as well. So the numbers I'm going to throw out there are YA fantasy numbers. The conversations I've had with other authors, what I see on the ground happening with editors and agents is referring to what's happening in YA fantasy, but the exact same things are happening in every other genre, just at a different word count range. And so I think this can generally apply. So I'm gonna start by telling you my whole journey with word count. As I was getting close to finishing my various drafts, I realized it was getting way too long, and so a lot of my edits were focused on getting it shorter. And by the time I finally queried, I had gotten so much feedback from readers and other authors who were all saying, it reads so fast, it's good as is, there's nothing else to remove. I was just sure I couldn't make it any shorter, and it was 121,000 words. And so I shot out a few queries. After sending out a few, I was like, what am I doing? This is far too high. And I managed to shave it down a little bit, and the majority of my queries went out at 118,000 words. So I did get requests, right? I am sure that I got some auto rejects for that length, but I did get requests, and all the requests that I got were from great agents and great agencies. So I'm not going to say that a long word count will mean that all agents won't look at it. They were willing to look at it. Then I eventually signed with my agent, Allie, with the manuscript at 118,000 words. Now, working with her, she had me add a lot into it. She has a great editorial eye, and she really helped me expand the story, but she also helped me cut. So I cut a lot. All those people saying there was nothing to cut, me being so sure there was nothing to cut, there was, once I had a really strong editorial vision helping me out. I was able to cut. But between cutting a lot and adding a lot, we still went on submission at 110,000 words. Now, at the time, I was in a submission group with hundreds of other authors, and I could not find a single other YA fantasy author whose agent let them go on submission above 100,000 words. So every YA fantasy author that I was speaking to was saying that they had made sure to cut it down to 100K before going on sub. And I was getting really nervous that we'd broken some cardinal rule and there was no way my book was gonna get picked up. Now, at the time, my agent was very new. Speaking of, all of this that I'm telling you doesn't necessarily apply in the same way now, because all of this was happening. Well, I was querying, I think 2 or 3 years ago at this point. So I was just saying my agent was new. She's not so new anymore. She's made a lot of great sales since. But at the time, she was very new. I was one of her first clients, and a lot of her experience, the agents that she assisted at Jane Chloe and Nesbitt were mostly adult focused. So I was concerned that maybe she just didn't have enough experience with YA and therefore had made a mistake, and we'd gone on submission with this ridiculous high number and it was a mistake and it wasn't going to sell. I should have trusted her a little bit more because it did, and in fact we got interest from 3 editors. But the first editor who offered, she wanted to buy the book, but she told me we were going to have to cut it to 80K, 80,000 words for a YA fantasy. Really short, and that would have been a cut of 30,000 words. And she told me that she loved the book as it was. She said it read really fast, it was really pacey, you know, she didn't feel there was anything that needed to be cut, but in order to fit the price point and, you know, just to be a match for what their imprint was looking for, I was gonna have to cut it if I signed with her. And at the time, I didn't know I was gonna get any other offers, and you know, I was willing to do whatever it would take to get my book on shelves, but this was really something I had to contend with, that I might have to chop a huge amount of my book. Luckily, both of the other 2 editors were fine with the word count. The editor that I signed with, who is at Simon & Schuster and Margaret K. McElderry, her name is Sarah McCabe. She likes big books, and she's a senior editor that has clout at her publisher, and they let her publish these big books. But as I'll mention soon, that's not the case with all publishers. I just got extremely lucky. In working with Sarah, once I signed with her, the book did grow more. And something I'll add in here is that some of the scenes that I had cut with Allie, just to get it really short, as short as we could to go on submission, I got to put back in when I was working with Sarah. As a rule, I do generally think that most things you cut are only going to make the book better and you're not going to want them back in, but there were a few things that I got to add back in, and that's something for you to keep in mind, like as a strategy. Just because you remove it for the sake of querying and for the sake of submission doesn't mean it won't be able to be in the final version of the book if you have an editor that wants to work with you and allow you to let it grow. So that's just something to keep in mind. Most likely my book is going to publish at close to 130,000 words, which is, you know, that number that if you try to query with a 130,000 word book, everyone's going to tell you it's going to be an auto reject. But, you know, a lot of stages happen in between. It grew with my agent, it grew with my editor. That was not the initial book that I had queried. One of the reasons that I think I got away with it, you know, something that my agent said, that all of the editors I spoke to said, that all of my readers said, was that my book reads really fast. It doesn't feel like a long book while you're reading it. And so I think that's part of why I got away with it. But that's not going to be the case for every long book, right? But if it is something you're dealing with, that you have a long book, that's something to look out for. Does it feel long when you're reading it, or does it just zoom by? So I wanted to share that story so that you know it is possible, but don't let that give you too much confidence to think that you should risk it yourself. So these are the reasons I think you should not do what I did, and you should be very wary of your word count. Remember, I'm sticking with YA fantasy numbers here, but I think these same conversations and things apply to other genres. In YA fantasy, the recommended word count to cap at before you start to query is 100K. Okay, I will generally say if you really need to, maybe make it to 110, but don't query above that. And here's why. The number one biggest reason is that almost all agents, really the majority of agents, won't submit a book to publishers that is above 100K. By a book, I mean YA fantasy. Okay, so they might take a look at your query. They might even sign you with a higher word count. But in their head, when they're looking at your query, before they've even read your pitch, before they've even read your pages, they are looking at the number of your word count and thinking they're going to have to help you trim it. So if it's 105K, they're thinking, okay, I'm gonna have to help them trim it by 5K. But if it's 125K, they're thinking, before they even know if they like the book, oh no, if I like this book, I'm going to help this author cut 25,000 words. And Agents are super busy right now and super backed up. And you've probably heard that more than ever, more and more agents are looking to take on more finished work. So while it's true that some agents will consider a manuscript at a higher length, you're really doing yourself a disservice because you're showing them from the get-go that they're going to have to put a lot of work in. If you're gonna have to cut it with them anyways, then you might as well cut it before, because there are some agents that won't even look at a manuscript over 100K. I know when I was querying, there were 2 agents I wanted to query who publicly said they won't ever take a YA fantasy over 100K. And if there was some people publicly saying it, that means there's other people behind the scenes, just, nixing them as soon as they see that word count. There are plenty who will consider it, but almost all of them won't put it on sub above 100K. Now, is it true that no agent is gonna sub a YA fantasy over 100,000 words? I'm just gonna tell you what I have seen and what I have heard, both in the submission group and again in the debut group. Now that I'm having a book coming out in 2025, I'm in the 2025 debut group, and I've asked around in there all the people who are publishing right now, who have recently sold to the publishing houses. What are they seeing happening? And the majority of them told me that their agents would not let them query above 100,000 words. The ones who didn't have that experience of their agent telling them that they had to be below 100 were already below 100. In all the people that I've spoken to in the past few years, I have only met 2 other people whose agents took them as a YA fantasy author on submission above 100,000 words. I'm positive there are more, but I was looking at a pretty big pool. So it really is the majority of agents that are thinking that way. And of the 2 other people that I spoke to, one of them sold their book, but the publisher told them in advance they were gonna have to cut it down. So even though they went on sub at a higher number, they had to commit to cutting it anyways. Now, that being said, there are a lot of authors in the debut group who are debuting above 100,000 words, because once they had their book purchased by the publisher, many of their editors are open to letting the books grow. But almost none of those people subbed to the editors at above 100,000 words, even though I did. Now, in terms of why are the agents not willing to sub these books above 100,000 words, I told you that some of these editors are letting the books grow. A lot of them are not. Many people that I've spoken to in the debut group and other places have been sharing how important it was to their publisher for them to cut their word counts down and keep their word counts low. Definitely some of the big 5 imprints saying you cannot go above 100,000 words. I even heard one big 5, I don't know if it's the whole publisher, if it was just this one imprint, said not above 90,000 words, right? Now, like I said, my imprint is fine with longer books, and plenty others are as well, but there are a lot that aren't. So the agents know if they want to have a pool to submit to, that there's a nice percentage of editors that aren't going to allow a book be published above 100,000 words. And so they're really diminishing their options if they choose to sub at a higher number. So with YA fantasy specifically, like I said, I'm hearing a lot of authors share that their editors wanted them to keep their word counts down. In some cases, it was a pretty big struggle. And then even those who did grow like closer to 120 have shared that it was definitely a priority at the end to trim things down, and that the editor definitely did want them to get it shorter, even if they allowed it to grow. I haven't had any of that on my end because I'm with one of the few publishers that is okay with long debuts. So I share all of this so that you can see the barriers of what is happening if you're submitting a book at a high word count, right? Whether it's YA fantasy or something else. If you're going far above the suggested word count, even if you'll get an agent's eyes on it, you're getting an agent's eyes who are already thinking, this book's gonna be a lot of work to deal with. And that might be a reason for them to reject. And if the reason you don't wanna get it down is because you don't wanna compromise the book itself, you're probably going to have to do that anyways to go on submission, unless you end up in a crazy situation like I did, where you have one of the very few agents that doesn't care. They exist, but there's not a lot of them, and you don't want to put yourself in a situation where you have 5 possible agents out of 80, and only 5 of them can consider your work, because it's hard to get an agent. You want as many options as possible. So why is this happening? Why are the editors and publishers caring so much about word count, and why are they not wanting to take longer books? It seems unfair, right? Why can non-debuts publish longer books? Why can other genres and other age categories publish longer books? So let's talk about that for a minute. There's a bunch of reasons. One of them is rising paper costs. Ever since COVID, paper costs have gone up by a lot. So it's actually a financial burden to publish a book at a certain length. But what's a much bigger deal for YA is actually the price of the book for consumers. A hardcover of an adult fantasy novel can sell for $30. A hardcover of a YA fantasy novel cannot sell for $30. People will not buy that. They're used to picking up a hardcover YA for $17.99. Okay, so if it is a beloved name that the publisher knows anyone is going to buy, they can actually make the price a little bit higher because people will buy it. But for a debut, no one is going to shell out the big money that it would cost to put out bigger books. And the sticker price of books is a really big issue right now. A lot of publishers are doing all kinds of things to get the cost of their physical books down so that they can keep the prices at a market rate. So for example, Wednesday Books, right? They have a lot of YA bestsellers. They are starting to put out more and more paperback first books because those are a lot cheaper to produce and they can be sold for a lot cheaper. You also might have noticed that Wednesday hardcovers are very often like the smaller hardcovers instead of the bigger ones, and they very infrequently have foil or like, fancy elements on the cover. All of these are to keep the book cost low, right? And then if we think about why can adult books be longer, well, on one hand, they can cost more. But on another hand, we have imprints like Tor that are doing a lot of paperback first, right? So if the book is going to come out first in paperback, it can be a lot thicker because it is cheaper to produce and it's cheaper to sell. Another thing to consider would be formatting, right? YA, it has to have a certain kind of readability and a certain kind of spacing, whereas some adult sci-fi fantasy can maybe be a little bit more cramped, slightly smaller print, maybe a little bit harder to read. That is more acceptable in adult fantasy formatting than it is in YA fantasy formatting. And if a book is formatted with smaller, less spaced words, then even a higher word count is going to have fewer pages, versus if it's having bigger fonts and bigger spacing, it's going to have a lot of pages. Another reason this is important to the publishers is because a longer book takes a lot longer to read, right? Editors right now are more overworked than ever, right? Despite the fact that publishers are actually doing quite well right now, they're all notoriously understaffed. This is a known big issue. And there's a lot of people who need to read this book in order to produce it. I have been shocked at how many times my editor needs to read my book, and like thoroughly with feedback. The longer your book is, that's like a lot of work for your editor and for everyone else involved that needs to put their eyes on it. A shorter book is easier for everyone involved. So when there's a super busy and understaffed imprint trying to produce a lot of books, shorter ones are going to be more economical in many, many ways. And something else to note is that it is not just debuts who deal with this, right? It seems that way sometimes, but at certain imprints, this is happening for their experienced authors as well. I have a memory of when I was querying, at the time I was still on Twitter, and I think it was on Twitter, and I think it was Trisha Levenseller. So it was probably around the time when Shadows Between Us came out. But she already had a lot of successful books behind her, right? Like Daughter of the Pirate Queen and Daughter of the Siren Queen and all of those books. And she made a thread about, I think it was in response to people saying that a lot of YA is not developed enough or something like that. And she made a response to that saying, well, like, we're limited in how much we can develop the world building of YA when editors start to get really antsy as our word count approaches 100,000 words, right? So that was a already really good selling established author saying that her editors, her publishers really wanted to keep things low. So this is going to really fluctuate by publisher. Some publishers are really willing to eat those costs. Some can't afford to. And you don't know who you're going to be able to sign with, and your agent wants to be able to give you as many opportunities as possible. Whatever genre you're writing in, whatever the word count expectations of that genre are, I imagine that these very same conversations are happening with those authors and those editors, where they're having their strict cap of what they expect these books to cost and how much they will cost to produce. So even if you're not writing YA fantasy, most of this probably still applies. But when it comes down to it, as much as these are all practical reasons, you also want to sell books, right? You want your book to sell to a lot of people. So you wouldn't want it to be too expensive for people to buy, or to like be made really cheaply because that's the only way they could afford to have that many pages, right? So in the long run, this is better for you as well, but it also kind of sucks that it's all money as opposed to being able to prioritize what's best for the story. Luckily though, I do think most books improve through a lot of editing, and we often see that, right? An author who's very beloved and doesn't need to be edited because people will buy their grocery shopping list, right? Sometimes we'll find those books are really bloated and might have been better if they had been forced to cut. So it's not always a bad thing, even though it can be really, really stressful in the early phases. I'm not going to tell you not to query your book above 100,000 words. I didn't listen to that advice, and I got a great book deal in the end. But I think that knowing how many opportunities you're losing and how slimmer your chances become, and understanding the ins and outs behind the scenes, hopefully that will help you realize what could be the best choices for you. I really hope this was useful. I hope it wasn't too discouraging, and I hope that it really helps you on your querying journey and gives you more tools to have a really successful querying experience.